So were you engineering over the weekend?
Oh yeah,
Or the week or?
yeah.
So was it for your first time knocking on the doors in the north?
Oh, it was, yeah. I got a good collection here.
What are the posters?
Yeah, leaflets.
Leaflets. Okay, right. So is Derry disappointing then, or is it?
I suppose so, but just because there was a serious chance for a seat, and
Yes.
but it seems like all the parties, smaller parties, had a
That's what
swing against them. So
that's what happens. It's kind of 1927 all over
Yeah,
again.
yeah.
When,
So in the end, we were just relieved to have our seat in West Belfast. Yeah.
okay, yeah.
So that was good anyway. But yeah, I think Sinn Féin a lot of kind of focusing on the Costellisms, kind of neutralised a lot of potential dissent, I suppose.
Do you just want to test the mic real quick? Just never maybe say
Yeah.
get started.
Testing, testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hello, hello.
I will, yeah.
Yeah?
So what do you think? Should they have left the statue? Should they have left the statue?
Longer cool stuff.
Yeah, just kind of similar
Yeah.
discussion afterwards.
Yeah,
That it wasn't up today.
Yeah.
Which was in flux at that stage.
Yeah.
So whenever.
That poster kind of suggests, the image of Lenin with the brush sweeping away.
Oh, does it?
Was that intended?
No, I mean a little bit of 1920 propaganda
Yes.
inspired, but I wanted it to feel Irish and modern a bit as well. So yeah, just a little bit.
Yeah, there's this famous image of Lenin on a globe where he's sweeping away the detritus of the past.
Yeah.
So the guy standing up reminding me it's just the pose I suggested. The human.
I almost gave him a mustache. I saw the photo that you just shared recently. What was the guy's last name?
Kremlin.
Yeah. Saw that he had a mustache. I almost put a mustache on the guy, but I couldn't find it.
That was his demob picture from the Navy, so he may not have had the mustache still, who knows. It's the only picture I've seen of him.
Oh, sure, yeah. That's good.
We'll start at 7 o'clock.
Yes.
You're all very early.
There was an issue in the 19th century about that there was an actual Galway time, which was 11 minutes later than Dublin. So it would have been an issue in court cases about licensing laws and so on. local time would have been observed before the railway, so this would have continued, the argument would have continued.
Some people still living by it.
Yes,
I've heard it every time as well, so
yeah, they're around the same 11 minutes or that.
yeah.
What would decide what the time or who came? Like,
Well, we observe Greenwich Mean Time now. Yeah, so it was necessary with the railways to have standardised time, so there's across the network. So if you see the Dillon's clock,
yeah, it says Dublin
they
time.
have Dublin time. So that was to distinguish it from the clock of St Nicholas's, which was set to local time.
Oh, so local time would have been set off the churches. Like, would have
Well,
been-
it was the traditional, the time determined by the sun. So,
So you take that into court. What was the just? You would take the sun. It would have been local time.
yeah,
People were still
take it
good
in.
by the St Nicholas's clock, or at least some thought we were good by.
I don't know how long St Nicholas's clock took to catch up with Dillon's clock, but it wouldn't have been that long, I would say. How did we end up there? Is it my fault? Is it talking about this?
On to the next meeting. I did it. Is this?
Oh, it's all live.
Yeah. Oh, great. I guess we should say as well, if people are asking questions in the Q&A or whatever, your audio is being streamed, but none of you are on camera. Don't worry. We start. We'll make a start. So, thanks for coming, everyone, and thanks for joining us online, whoever has joined us online. And thanks for John for coming today to speak. He's John Cunningham is a lecturer in history in NUIG, and he's going to speak about some very interesting and hopefully inspirational events that happened here in Galway 100 years ago this month. So I'll give you over to John now.
Gur magat is onor dom vecha an seach anocht cant when an over seach agus tám buich as an chora is as berle a me cant ach be me an kestina ragart an oilge egedera. Okay, so I see this is advertised as a conversation, so I suppose that means that you can ask me a question whenever you feel like it. I may not answer it immediately, or I may, but yeah, so feel free to interrupt. I have some slides and I have something of a text, but I don't intend to stick too rigidly. So we're in May 1922. This is Galway. That's May the 25th, 1922 was the last day when Eyre Square looked like that, with that fine monument as it was described after its destruction. So it was Ascension Thursday, in fact, the day that the statue was pulled down. Significant probably because a lot of people, it was a church holiday, a lot of people weren't at work on the day, so it would have been a busy day in town, country people shopping and so on, a day that would have been observed as a holiday. So it's about, in the bigger picture of things, it's about 10 months since the truce, 6 months since the treaty negotiations, 3 months since the departure of Crown forces, of which there had been perhaps 2,000 in Galway up to February. So you have soldiers, auxiliaries, tans and so on scattered throughout the town and suburbs in barracks and in commandeered buildings. One Republican complained that one was never more than 100 yards from a barracks, whether it was an improvised one or an established one. So there had been a tense atmosphere and many violent episodes, most notoriously the murder of Father Griffin in November 1920. Most people were happy enough to see the back of the British forces, but not everyone, because 200 people attended a ball to say farewell to the 17th Lancers in the town hall. More generally, Ireland had gone through a decade of dislocation and struggle, commencing with the Home Rule crisis, continuing with the 1913 lockout, World War I, 1916 rising, conscription crisis, and so on. Most of us are familiar with a lot of what is remembered as constituting the Irish Revolution, in particular with the military and certain of the political developments. Social historians and labour historians contend, however, that there's a lot about the period that isn't familiar. And I don't mean just mean obscure episodes like the one we're talking about here this evening. Military and political developments obviously have their importance, but underpinning them was the mobilisation of the Irish people in a variety of struggles, from the 1918 anti-conscription strike through land seizures, strikes, Soviets, and so on. Most of the social science definitions of revolution stress mass mobilisation as a necessary part of it all, yet the mass mobilisation part of the Irish Revolution is often overlooked when people talk about the experience here. A key to a lot of what happened was the radicalising effect of World War I. You had full employment, or near it. You had increased state regulation of the economy. You had the effects of very high inflation, especially with regard to food prices, which had combined to radicalise people and to rejuvenate the trade union movement, which had been reduced to a low level after the defeat of of the 1913 lockout. So you go in a period of 4 years, 1916 to 20. The most radical of the unions, the ITGWU, increased its membership from 5,000 at its lowest ebb to 100,000 in a relatively small population. So the ITGW expanded into most parts of the country, into villages as well as towns, as we'll see later on. And the 1916 rising, the threat of conscription had given a political aspect to the mobilisation of workers and indeed to the mobilisation of small farmers. Another feature of the period was that the slate had been wiped clean in some respects. The possibilities seemed endless, with apparently indestructible empires, Russian, Austro-Hungarian and so on, collapsing in the later stages of the war. Who knew what might arise in their place? The Russian Revolution in particular had a resonance insofar as it seemed to have placed working people in charge. And for many people in Ireland, in the labour movement especially, it provided a possible model for an independent Ireland. The executed James Connolly, leader of the 1916 Rising, had advocated what he called a workers' republic. For many people, this was almost identical to what had been brought about by the Bolsheviks in Russia. And the ITGWU, this radical, growing union, was active in disseminating James Connolly's ideas and indeed also in publicising the Russian Revolution. So in the context of the breakdown of order, which coincided with the outbreak of the War of Independence, the RIC were abandoning their police stations and so on. Labour and agrarian unrest was unrestrained. There were no police to interfere, as it were. And that's the context of the outbreak of the so-called Soviets, the best known of which was the Limerick Soviet of April 1919. This was a general strike in the city of Limerick in opposition to the imposition of martial law type restrictions in the city. So the name Soviet was applied disparagingly initially. So it was the Irish Times which was kind of mocking what happened in Limerick, bestowed the name Soviet upon it in the first instance. But as time went by, the term was embraced, as it were, by the people involved. And that's quite clear in the case of the best known photo, certainly, of, it's probably familiar to you, of the brewery worker Soviet, where they kind of declare, "We make bread, not profits," clearly an anti-capitalist statement there. Brewery, County Limerick, is known as the place where somebody important lived for spent his youth. Does anybody know? Who's from Brewery? Eamon de Valera grew up from whatever the age of 2 when he came back from the States. So the people involved in that were probably sitting beside de Valera in primary school. Anyway, so the typical Soviet of the era of this period, 1919, 20, 21, 22, it involved the seizure of a workplace by its workers during an industrial dispute, generally, and the workers would then proceed to run it under their own control. In the settlement of the dispute, the enterprise would be handed back to the legal owners. So that's the general picture. One of the longest lasting of the Soviets was in this part of the world, in North Connacht, on the Arigna mines on the borders of Arigna and of Leitrim and Roscommon, which ran for several months of the summer of 1921. And the most widespread was the Cleves Creameries Soviet of 1922, in a chain of creameries throughout the counties of Tipperary, Limerick, Tipperary and Cork, which were taken over by their workers who ran them or tried to run them. They'd been there before, earlier on. So the Cleves Soviets then overlapped with the one that we're here to talk about today. Quite what constituted a Soviet is something of a grey area. The extent to which they were generally revolutionary objectives involved varied from one to another, and frequently there's ambiguity, there's a lack of information, so it's not quite clear. And I suppose one question which I won't answer is whether the events in Galway deserved the designation of a Soviet. It was the Connacht Tribune, the local newspaper, that bestowed that title. But it's clear that the leaders were happy enough to run with it. So just to get back to the event, sorry, the date's wrong, it's the 25th, sorry, of Ascension Thursday, 1922. So I'm just going to talk through the events of this day, which was the beginning, I suppose, of the events that were described as the Soviet. So the people involved are members of the Town Tenants League. I'll come to in a moment what the Town Tenants League was. They marched behind a band to the town hall, where a meeting between leaders of the Town Tenants movement had arranged to meet councillors to talk about a housing scheme, a scheme of public housing. The meeting was cancelled by the councillors, so there was great irritation on the part of the assembled tenants, and Stephen Cremin and William J. Larkin. We'll be coming to both of those people. Cremin was a local leader of the union and tenants movement, and William J. Larkin was a national leader of the tenants movement who happened to arrive. So they lead an invasion of the council chamber. The councillors just leave. The place is heaving. You have band instruments, hundreds of people cramming into this space in the town hall. The speechifying, which had started outside, continued inside, and Cremin announced that this council is not doing its job. It's in hoc to landlords, and it'll never do its work. So it's defunct. We're taking over. We're going to elect a workers' council in a few days' time in order to give effect to the demands of the town tenants. So that's briefly what Cremin says, and announces that everybody will get together again in Eyre Square that evening at the statue of Lord Dunkellin, which you saw earlier on. So we get to the square that evening. There are thousands of people assembled, according to the newspaper reports, and there's two men get busy with hacksaws at the feet of the monument. Others tie a rope, as represented on the poster here, around the neck, and they pull the statue to the ground. There are further speeches again from the plinth, as shown here in our excellent poster, and the people then line up behind a marching band. The statue is hauled through the town to as far as Nimmo's Pier. There are different newspaper accounts actually give a different end point, but all agree that it was thrown into the sea. And as it was thrown into the sea, the band struck up I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles, which was a hit song at the time. I think it's still popular. Is it a football? Is it associated with some soccer team? Some English? Sorry? West Ham. Yes, West Ham United. Anyway, it wasn't associated with West Ham United then, but it was a popular tune. So it gives you some something of the atmosphere. There was a kind of humour around as well. So anyway, what about Lord Dunkellin? What was the problem with Lord Dunkellin? Where is he here? That's the statue, different angle. So why was he chosen, as it were? The statue itself was by a noted sculptor called Foley, John Henry Foley, responsible for the O'Connell Monument and lots of other monuments around the world, all over the British Empire, indeed. So that was part of the criticism of those who pulled it down. This is a great work of art by a noted Irish artist. But it wasn't Foley, of course, that the people object to. Rather, and it wasn't even Dunkellin, in fact, himself. Dunkellin was a member of the de Burgh family, which had founded Galway in the 13th century. They owned a substantial part of the county, including parts quite close to the city, the area around Tirellan and Terryland and out to Castlegar and so on. So they did have property, but most of their property was in the east of the county. So Dunkellin had been MP for Galway. He died of something called Bright's disease. I don't know what that is. I wasn't curious enough to look it up. At a young enough age, and there was a great mourning among the aristocracy, and they came together to erect the monument. Now, there was a general belief, I don't know if it was true, it probably wasn't, but it may have been. Ultimately, I suppose the money for it came from tenants anyway, from their rents. But there was a belief that there was a specific levy on the Clanrickard tenantry to pay for the statue. So this was during the period of the land war then. The brother, this guy here, Lord Clanrickard, who lived up to 1916, he inherited all the property that would have gone to Dunkellin. So he became probably the most notorious of Irish landlords. There were a number of eviction cases around the mid-1880s, around the plan of campaign and so on. And he was a resolute opponent of tenant rights or of any effort to clip the wings of the aristocracy, the hereditary owners. So the statue then really is unpopular because of him rather than because of his brother who was represented. And it was frequently mentioned in speeches of the Land League era that what's the disgrace that this statue is in the square. But it took the Town Tenants League in 1922 to remove it. Right, the Town Tenants League then, we just talk about it for a moment. This is a movement which has existed since the beginning of the century. It had a precursor in the late 19th century. The objective of the Town Tenants League, the founding objective was to secure for tenants in towns the rights that tenant farmers had in the countryside through the Land League and successor movements. It was closely tied up with Redmond's party, with the Irish party, and it purported to represent all urban tenants. So that meant it purported to represent people living in slums as well as commercial tenants, shopkeepers and so on. And oftentimes, and this was a criticism made by many indeed, that it really mostly represented the the better off urban town tenants. This obviously changed in 1922. There were 3 previous incarnations that I found of the Galway Town Tenants League. This was the first one that was kind of from the ground up, that represented the poorer town tenants. So that's one objective. Obviously, if you, the question of security of tenure, rents, and so on is only one part of it. They responded to grievances as they emerged among tenants. But security of tenure, reasonable rent, and so on is fairly is a fairly broad brief in any case. Now, the chap who came then from Dublin via Limerick was a leader of a tenants movement, of a breakaway from this movement in Dublin, called William J. Larkin. He shared the background of Big Jim Larkin, but they weren't related. They were both children of Irish parents, grew up in England, came back to Ireland. Larkin attracted attention first as a Catholic actionist, protesting, breaking up filthy plays and protesting at films and various things like that. And he was even denounced by his namesake in 1913 for activities that he was involved with. But anyway, in 1916, he led a breakaway from this kind of staid tenants movement, and he was subsequently involved in militant actions in Dublin, resisting evictions of tenants, defending tenants threatened with eviction, and so on. In 1919, he was assaulted by a well-known individual called William J. Cosgrave, who was subsequently, from late 1922, the leader of the government. So frustrated was Cosgrave by his argument, indeed, at a meeting. Now, so moving quickly, I could tell you a lot more about William J. Larkin, but I won't. I'll resist the temptation. In early 1922, Larkin is based in Limerick. He seems to have gone down there to join a remarkable housing action that was taking place in Limerick, alongside John Cronin, who was a leader who's remembered as the head of the Limerick Soviet of 3 years earlier. So they're involved at this point in a Limerick City Workers' Housing Association. But the interesting thing that they do here, and this is at a moment where there is an acute housing crisis, is they go and seize houses and properties that are being vacated by the departing British forces, particularly officers' accommodation. So in each of those units, they place families that are in need of housing. So quite an interesting action then. And that's what Kremen was doing, or what Larkin was doing, or what he was involved with before he comes to Galway in May 1922. Is that okay? Is that too much information? Will I give you a break and you can ask a question? I need to draw a breath anyway. I forgot water. Anyone with a question or an observation? Yeah?
You were saying that the Irish Times bestowed the name of Soviet on the Limerick activists.
Yeah.
Then the Connacht Tribune gave a similar title to the people
Yeah.
of Galway. Did the Irish Times themselves offer any commentary on the Galway Soviet?
Most of the commentary that I came across was in the local newspapers, and can't remember if I found something in the Irish Times. It was covered nationally, but there was so much going on. I talked about the Cleves Soviets. There were other seizures going on all around the country in this moment. This is the period between the between the treaty and the Civil War. So there's so there's kind of uncertainty about what's going to happen next. There's a feeling that the tide is going out a little bit as far as workers' rights are concerned. So you have workers moving to try to halt the direction of things, as it were, all around the country. So the Galway incident didn't attract enormous national attention, except with regard to the destruction of the statue. Is that okay? Yeah. So it was intended disparagingly. It wasn't necessarily taken up in that way by those who were tarred with this brush. Some of them were proud of it. But in those two instances that I mentioned, Limerick and here, it was the press that applied the name. But it was in general the discourse of the time anyway. And as I said, there were those who were kind of proud to wear the badge and to be called Bolsheviks if they were to be called Bolsheviks, which they were. Bolshi was a term that was widely used at the time to describe people who were kind of being rebellious in any way at all. Okay, so that's the Town Tenants League. I suppose the other, talking about the moment, as it were, there's a couple of issues that are taken up. There's a quote here, I think, from Larkin, which he makes. That's the town hall. It's a different gathering. That's from some years earlier, a Gaelic League gathering, but that's the building. I don't know. Can you read that? So this is part of the discourses around the events that I'm talking about. Who made the laws under which you live at the present time? So calling property rights into question. The thieves of the country is the answer, according to Larkin. Who robbed you of every right you ever possessed and continues to do it today? What law are you under? Why are we not under the Brehon Code if we have an Irish government? Is it because there are too many clauses in that code which are favourable to the tenantry? Are there slum owners on the bench in Galway? No parish or district justice should preside here or in any town in Ireland unless he is put there by the people who make the laws for Ireland. So this is kind of reflecting a fear, I suppose, that the new order won't be much different to the old order in some respects. And you can see during the kind of putting aside of the measures that were brought in place in terms of alternative courts and so on. So they're moving back into the courthouses and replacing the petty sessions with district courts and so on. So there's a fear essentially that having had a kind of form of popular justice in the Sinn Féin courts and in the land courts of the previous number of years, that all of this has been set aside and we're back to Queen Victoria's laws, as Kremen would put it. So that's one part of the context, and I suppose the fear is based on decisions which went against tenants in the previous few months in the courts, where the justice is found in favour of landlords rather than tenants, and so evictions proceeded. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious if there was a precipitating incident that turned him to this.
Turned him from being a Catholic actionist to being.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's about the moment. I think there's a kind of a radicalisation going on, and he goes back to being what he was before, essentially, somewhat more radical. But I think he's caught up in the kind of popular frenzy of the period. Probably he remains. he tries to reconcile Catholicism with Bolshevism, essentially, as we'll see in a quote later on, which wasn't that unusual. There was a meeting in the town hall, which was in 1920, just 2 years before this, at which Captain Jack White spoke. Again, by this point, he's a supporter of the Russian Revolution, but it's chaired by a Franciscan, who's kind of a Franciscan priest. Yeah, there's a lot of sense in what you say there, Jack. So there's a kind of a ferment, a flux, and people are carried along, as it were, and try to rationalise what they thought previously, I think, and make sense of it in a new context. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, where were we? Yeah, so the other context then is about housing. And this is a kind of a flashpoint for people, a source of mobilisation. By and large, in the from the 1880s on through to the First World War, the rural housing problem had largely been resolved through labourers' acts and so on. So you had labourers' housing built throughout the country. Urban housing, as those of you who are aware of the Dublin events of 1913 and so on, where a lot of attention is paid to housing, urban slums were left undisturbed. There was some legislation, Artisans' Dwellings Act and so on, which weren't really taken up by the local authorities. So the urban people were living in squalor. There was a housing scarcity, but there was also a housing. The quality of the housing was very poor. So that's, I suppose, the context in which the town tenants mobilised, and they're given some encouragement in the aftermath of the First World War. Lloyd George, who was our Prime Minister, declared in the British context that he was going to build homes fit for heroes. So there was a scheme in Britain, I think, announcing, I can't remember how many 100,000 houses, but a lot of houses. There was a parallel scheme in Ireland as well, which promised, I think I can't remember how many, 50,000 houses to be built in urban Ireland, and considerable number. So popular was it that even the Sinn Féin, supporting local authorities from 1920, supported it, supported the idea of this urban housing. By the time it came to it in 1922, it had been diluted somewhat. There was the £1 million scheme, which sounded like a lot of money, but it meant something like 2,000 houses, in fact. This was under the new government. So it's a big drop from 50,000, a promise of 50,000, which wasn't delivered, to 2,000, which is promised by the provisional government. And it's in that context that the discussions were happening between the Town Tenants League and the local councillors. It was about a Galway Galway Council taking up what finance was available to do that. Okay, am I talking for a long time? Okay, we still haven't really got to the main. There's a lot of context here. Right. There's our man here, Stephen Cremin. Have we got him? Oh yeah, there he is. So he grew up close to here, just down the road in Raleigh Row. Family were brushmakers, which was a dying trade, a dying occupation in the early 20th century. There are quite a few in the 1881, 1891 census, hardly any of them left. So in his early 20s he heads off to the United States, settles in a place called Dedham, Massachusetts, which was famous subsequently for the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a small enough town near Boston. He was working as a pipe fitter there for many years, and for some strange reason, which I don't understand, because he was called up to the American Navy. He was called in the draft of 1918, but he ended up serving in the British Merchant Navy. I have no idea, because he'd spent how this happened, or what the mechanics of it were. But anyway, he spent some months in the Merchant Navy towards the end of the war, and then he finds himself back in Galway in 1919. Evidently, he had union organising experience in Boston, or it was believed that he had, certainly because he was appointed secretary of the ITGWU in Galway in late 1919 and establishes this a Town Tenants League branch in 1922. Right, just a little bit on Galway before I go on for a little bit more context. Galway is a much smaller place than it is now, about a fifth of its current population, and it had been more important prior in previous centuries, and indeed in previous decades. Its population fell at every census since between 1851 and 1911. Little industry, working class housing, notoriously bad and insecure. Anybody who's familiar with the biography of Nora Barnacle, who lived here and had something like 10 addresses before she was 10, would kind of get some sense of it. It was a place where Labour radicalism was slow to take root. There wasn't an ITGWU branch formed till November 1918, which lagged even behind the small towns. There's a quote there about the growth of the transport union in the vicinity. So quite not a very radical place. When the ITGWU is established, then there's difficulty. The steadier employments are all organised, and moreover, the union, the ITGW, is identified by the authorities with Sinn Féin. So organisers essentially are on the run. So it's difficult to achieve much in that particular context. So Cremen, we can't say, had made an enormous impact in the period after his appointment. Right, okay, so just to get back to what you came to hear, I suppose. So we have several thousand people then assembling in the square on Ascension Thursday evening for the scheduled Town Tenants League meeting. You have the men sawing at the base of the statue, pulling it down, and the Cremen, Larkin and a third man called Paul Kiley mount the plinth and give their speeches. One thing that's quite striking about this is that there's no reports of women involved. You would have thought an issue like housing would have involved women. So Cremen is quite exultant at the pulling down of the statue, and he declares that every symbol of its kind in Ireland should be removed, and a monument to what he calls a good Irish man be put up in its place. You have more speeches, statue, as we say, dragged through the town. There wasn't any resistance. There were soldiers and police of the Free State. They were of the nascent Free State, if we were like, and there were also anti-treaty forces. So nobody tried to intervene to stop it. The Galway Observer summed up the proceedings as follows in its headline: "The Dunkellen Monument, symbol of landlord tyranny, pulled down and drowned amidst plaudits of thousands." So that's the headline. Suggests a kind of grudging approval of what went on in regard to the statue. At further meetings that the following evening, it was declared that Eyre Square which was named for a landlord also, that the name is to be changed. So they found a local hero to name it after. Who might that have been? He wasn't, yeah, not yet. His statue ended up replacing Dunkellen. Father Griffin. So they declare who had been killed in November 1920. So they renamed the square Father Griffin Square. So there's his, that's a campaign. Anyway, rather than the heir family of Cromwellian settlers and landowners. And it wouldn't stop there. Larkin urged, for the tenant movement would ensure that the lion and the unicorn, which were above the courthouse, that they would be taken down too. In fact, they were removed by officialdom in the 1930s, and you can go and look at them behind the quadrangle in the university if you want. But the obsolete Urban Council, it was also announced, would be replaced by a tenant-friendly body at a further meeting on Sunday. And after the speeches, they burned an effigy of a landlord, and the crowd lined up behind a fife and drum band and proceeded to Eyre Street, where an unoccupied house was seized. This was owned by Joseph Young, OBE manufacturer of mineral waters and a prominent local unionist councillor in the town. So a needy family was placed there in that vacant house. They then proceeded up to Forster Street. There's another vacant house. Who owns that vacant house? The Magdalen Asylum, the Mercy Sisters. So they seized that house too, place another needy family in there. So doubtless there's a kind of a political point being made of some sort there in the choice of properties owned by the prominent Anglican and by the Catholic religious orders. As you might expect, denunciation follows. For the Tuam Herald, I quote, "It was nauseating and disgusting that a wild crowd vented their blind rage on a bit of bronze and made their once historic city a byword for reproach." And the destruction of the statue is also, sorry, I have a quote here somewhere. What I had? Yeah, there we are. This is the Pro Cathedral, which you're probably familiar with, in the corner of Abbeygate Street and Middle Street, isn't that right? Which was the main church prior to the building of the cathedral in the 1960s. So Canon Nestor, senior clergyman, preaching the following Sunday, and I quote here, "Such an act was a grave violation," he's talking about the statue specifically, "of the 4th and 7th commandments, of the 4th as a usurpation of lawful authority, and of the 7th in the wanton destruction of property by men who did not own it. Whosoever statue it was the property of the citizens of Galway, and the only authority in town that could lawfully remove it is the Urban Council as representing the citizens. By what right, then, did those men take it on themselves to pull down and destroy the statue? The deed savours of Bolshevism. In other words, it is the deed of men who recognise no authority but their own. It is well to take this opportunity of pointing out that there are doctrines being preached in Galway lately which are in direct opposition to the teachings of Catholic theology and therefore rank heresy." So that's a forthright denunciation. So, presumably a lot of the people involved in the removal of the statue are there in the Pro Cathedral. They were Catholics. So with the denunciation still ringing in their ears, they assemble again to an Eyre Square on the Sunday afternoon for the elections which have been announced for this Workers' Council, but also for workers' magistrates to implement Brehon law and justice rather than Victoria's laws, which they feared were being restored. certainly William J. Larkin didn't pull back anything at that point. Responding, it would seem, to the priest, he says, "Bolshevism is the purest ring from the bell of the people's call for justice. I am proud of being a Catholic, but twice as proud of being an Irish Bolshevik." So I suppose responded to the sermon. The business of the meeting, of the Sunday afternoon meeting, was then announced in a resolution, which I'll quote: "In public meeting assembled at Father Griffin Square, we, the tenants of Galway, having deposed the existing useless body of councillors of the urban district of Galway on Ascension Thursday 1922, hereby approve and appoint the following councillors for Galway as the council best fitted to act for the people. The new council to operate from May the 29th, 1922. And it was announced that the new body would convene on the following Wednesday in the People's Council room, and council employees were instructed to produce the documents necessary for the proceedings. 12 men, again all men, were nominated, 3 for each of the urban wards, and it's not possible to establish whether all had agreed to be nominated. Some of them obviously were there, so we're speaking Paul Kiley, Kremen, and the national, one of the FU union activists, all participated in proceedings. We can't be so sure if the Labour councillors Colohan and Ray were pleased to be on this workers' council, and some of the others. And likewise, following those elections, there was no contest, there were just people nominated. A slate of 7 justices was adopted, and all of them from the same list of councillors. And they were to ensure, quote, that all foreign law be abolished and replaced by the people's will. And that was that, more or less. William J. Larkin announced his departure in a conciliatory letter to the local papers, which was different in tone to his speeches. He more or less urged the authorities look after the tenants. So quite a conciliatory, no kind of radical message worth really. And by the time the letter was published, the authorities had indeed evicted the needy tenants who had been placed in the two houses that I mentioned, and restored them to their legal owners. And when Kremen and J.J. McNamara, another of the councillors, the workers' councillors, arrived at the town hall for their scheduled meeting of their People's Council, their Workers' Council, on the Wednesday, they found their way barred by an armed guard. Armed guards were deployed for a period outside meetings of the established urban council, lest there be an effort to repeat the Soviet as it were. So the Soviet, if it deserves the designation, was a 4-day wonder in a place where there had been relatively little labour militancy, and where the major agent of labour militancy, the ITGWU, was relatively weak. So frustrated, however, were Galway's working class people at the housing situation that they joined this unpromising organisation, the Town Tenants League, to get their voices heard. So, commencing with the occupation of the council chamber on the Thursday, the Soviet was practically over before its last act on Sunday afternoon, the selection of the People's Councillors and Justices in the renamed Father Griffin Square. The authorities took care to ensure that the Workers' Council did not meet, and the episode had little discernible impact either with regard to expediting council housing or to leaving a mark on local memory. The Dunkellen statue was sometimes discussed in the local press in the following decade, but the context of its removal was always forgotten, it seemed. And when it was mentioned, it was as a purely nationalist affair. So in the dominant narrative of the revolutionary period, as I said at the beginning. Social struggle was delegitimised or hidden, and when the toppling of the Dunkellen statue was remembered at all, it was, a quote again, a burst of patriotism of the type that led recently to the blowing up of the Nelson Pillar in Dublin. So that was the context in which it was mentioned in 1966. And the occasions when the Dunkellen statue was remembered included the commentary surrounding the unveiling of the Pádraig Ó Conaireachta statue in 1935, and obviously that was consistent with Cremen's wish that a good Irishman, as it were, be put in the place. And the granite plinth can still be seen. It was used for the Republican monument in Castlegar, so they chipped off the old inscription roughly on one side, so you can see that still out there, and it's rededicated to Óglaí na hÉireann out there since 1951. So the relative lack of impact was due to the transient character of the town tenants movement in Galway, and the fact that its leaders really didn't follow through. As a visiting organiser, Larkin can hardly be faulted for returning to Limerick, where he was the leader of a significant movement, and Cremen was seemingly a capricious individual in any case. He had greater responsibility, but he was immediately caught up in another controversy, a row within the ITGWU, which was downsizing rapidly in 1922, 1923, and also kind of centralising decision making and so on. So he was a casualty of that. And he went off and he set up his own union, which survived for about 18 months in the county of Galway. So the name was given, Soviet was given by opponents or detractors. There's some sense in which that it was embraced by the principal actors in the episode in their identification with Bolshevism in their speeches. The Galway Soviet differed from most of the other episodes that were described as Soviets during the period, which, as I said at the outset, they were workplace seizures. And I suppose there's an effort to claim some authority here by a workers' council, but the extent to which this was more than symbolic is not clear. Certainly there's a lot of symbolism about the removing the symbols of landlordism in one way or another. Whether the councillors and the magistrates were intended to actually carry out any function of authority is not clear. But I suppose the significant action, if you like, which suggested serious intent, was the seizure of the several houses, because this was imitating an incident which was serious, involving up to 70 houses in Limerick. So it might perhaps have been intended to have they might have intended to extend that, but it's not clear. As I said, the evidence is thin enough, and so on. We can only hypothesize about intentions. Yes, I've gone on for quite long enough, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. I should have clarified at the start that my name is Adrian Curran. I'm the People Before Profit rep for Galway, and this is an event organised by the Galway branch of People Before Profit, just to make that clear. We'll take some questions now, and also if you're watching online, do we have questions from You can leave questions in the comments wherever you're watching, and we can get them as well. But we'll go to the room here first if anyone has any questions or comments.
I just find Larkin a very fascinating character at this point. I don't know much about him, but to think that he went from down with this sort of thing to declaring himself a Bolshevik
Yes.
is quite a turn.
Yes, it was a process as well. I think there's no indication once he became prominent as a tenant leader that he was involved in the other sort of stuff. And he went back. He spent his life as an advocate of tenant rights in a kind of a low-key way, intervening legally and so on. So right through his life, he maintained this position as a kind of a one-man band with an office in Middle Abbey Street in Dublin, issuing the occasional statement. One thing he was, one cause he did take up, which is interesting, was Nelson's pillar. He, on a number of occasions, he urged that it be removed. So there was some thread there from 1922, but of course he was long dead before it was removed in the dramatic way that it was. He died in 1954, I think, as quite an elderly man. In his mid-70s, not that elderly, by our standards. Yeah.
I've got a question on Facebook. Was asking from Lily Cumming. He asked, do we know if the occupied houses were returned to their owners?
Yes, they were taken back by the authorities, and within days, once the thing cooled down, so they were handed back to Joseph Young and to the Sisters of Mercy fairly promptly. With regard to Limerick, it's kind of a more interesting case. That was a year-long process, in fact, and ultimately it was resolved as a compromise of sorts following the intervention of the Bishop of Limerick. Larkin, whatever about his feelings towards the Catholic hierarchy in 1913, he can't have been too favourably disposed towards the Bishop of Limerick because he was denounced in very, very stern terms by the Bishop of Limerick for his involvement in the housing in the housing seizures down there, and he had the cheek as well to point to the papal encyclical Rerum Novarum, which was the kind of pro-worker encyclical of 1891, and to quote this to the bishop. So the bishop did not take kindly to be told how to do his job or how to interpret the papal documents. So that really so that provoked a further denunciation. Ultimately, the bishop bypassed the group in Limerick, the Trades Council connected group in Limerick, and negotiated with tenants individually. It wouldn't have anything to do with the organisation involved in the seizures. But it took 10 months to resolve Limerick. It was quite a sustained struggle. As for the number of houses involved, I think it's 28 is the number mentioned initially, but it seems they subsequently seized others, because Larkin was certainly claiming 70 when he was in Galway in May.
What would you attribute to the difference between Limerick and Galway as regards radicalism and trade unions?
Well, there's a big difference in the sizes of the two places to begin with, and there's a difference, I suppose, in the character as well. Limerick is an industrial city, and the issue around the Limerick Soviet was the fact that a lot of people had to go past the city boundaries in order to go to work. city boundaries was narrower than the urban area proper. So it was the issue that brought things to a head and that caused the Trades Council to move into to take the action it did, was that people would be obliged to produce a pass which they could get from the military authorities in order to get to their jobs. So this was what sparked the Limerick Soviet. You didn't have any equivalent. The biggest industry in Galway at the time was the Galway woolen mill, which probably had less than 100 workers, mainly young women, very young women, teenagers out of school and so on. So there wasn't anything on that scale. The dockers were important, and the other workers in docks associated work, in the merchants' yards, McDonough's and so on in particular. They were generally in the older established British-based dockers union. So they were kind of they weren't part of the zeitgeist with the ITGW, as it were, and Kremen was picking up the people who it hadn't been possible to organise before. So some workers in the woolen mills, people in the university and grounds, you know, the support workers in the university, and in a few places where the dockers union hadn't recruited. I don't know, does that explain? It doesn't explain. And also there is a very heavy presence of military and police in the place for a very small population. 13,250 or something people. It's quite a small population in any case.
Great question here.
Yeah, just a couple of points. I suppose just kind of bringing it into kind of more kind of modern context. I suppose, like, I mean, when you talk about like the statue of John Kellan and that, and obviously Nelson's Common as well, like, it reminds me of like when like the Black Lives Matter protesters a couple of years ago when they were tearing down like statues like Colson, Bristol, or Confederate statues of the US. And you know, the issue I raised at the time was, of course, it was around the Christopher Columbus Memorial down here by the Spanish Arch. And like, I mean, you know, I raised that in the media. Like, well, I mean, we should be talking about that as well. Like, it's you know, it's a memorial to someone who committed genocide and started mass colonialism and slave trade and everything. So I think there's still kind of, we still need to be having that discussion about monuments and memorials, like who we commemorate and who we memorialise. And then the other issue just down about around housing and trade unions, like it's interesting that like the ITGW at the time and like people like Lark and Cameron seem so kind of militant around housing, like, and it's then when you look at, we're in the midst of such a housing crisis at the moment, and there is kind of moves to try and create a housing movement, but it's like, and trying to get the unions involved in it, it's like trying to drag them along, and there's a lot less militant. It seems like they're a lot less militant now. Like, it's how do we get them to become more militant again? Like, and I suppose it's the question is then how do we do that? Or do you think there's any kind of parallels or any kind of lessons we can learn from the period from 1919 to 22 that we can use now in today's context?
Yeah. Right.
Easy question.
I suppose I found when reading around the Colston monument, the destruction of that, echoes, the discussion around it did have echoes of the discussion around the destruction of the Galway monument of 1922, and I suppose the places of the individuals commemorated were such that they had nobody to defend them, really. But at the same time, there was people power or mob rule or whatever else isn't the appropriate way to go about it. You have this point being made. But I guess the popular movements had been talking about Dunkellen for the previous 40 years. And it wasn't particularly mourned, and but you do have other monuments that survive from that era. But I suppose the particular moment is singular in a way, and I think Kremen as an ITGWU leader was not typical at the particular moment in addressing the housing question, but he may have gone down that route because he was somewhat frustrated as an organizer, as a union organizer, if you see what I mean, because there's inter-union disputes at the time, which there would be indeed coming down the tracks throughout the country at that stage. So it's difficult to apply, I suppose, things that happened in that particular context of tremendous uncertainty as to what was. It's before the Civil War. People didn't know there was a civil war or there was going to be one. Labour in the Labour Party and Trade Union Congress in the previous months, in April, had called a one-day general strike against militarism, as was the phrase that they used, to halt the kind of tendency towards civil war that they kind of observed in the situation. So it's a very kind of difficult or a moment that's not easy to not going to be replicated precisely in any case. But I guess unions and labour movements historically have embraced the whole of the conditions of their members. So it's not. It shouldn't be a big ask, as it were, that housing be prioritised as much as any other issue, because it affects the conditions of the people, of working people. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you knew whether the Labour councillors were at the time were particularly radical. Like, for example, if the same events happened today, I couldn't imagine Neil McNeish or anyone being sympathetic towards them, or anyone else for that matter. Like, how did they show their support towards it, or did they just kind of use it for their own gain?
Yeah, as I said, I don't have any evidence of their disposition beyond the fact that they stayed behind when the council chamber was invaded, whereas all the other councillors left. So they clearly felt that some sense of belonging with what was going on, that it represented their kind of constituents, or their cause more generally. As I said, their presence, they didn't take a prominent part, as you might expect from councillors if they were fully enthusiastic, in the subsequent proceedings, if the newspaper reports, patchy as they are any indication. Both of I actually, when I first became interested in this, the brother of Councillor Ray was still alive, and I spoke to him, but he didn't know anything about it. He had no memory of this at all. But he was quite an elderly man who lived in Chantilly. Yeah. But I don't know if that's adequate. But again, the moment is different. I think Ray certainly was a member of the ITGWU. So this is a movement which is new and radical, and they have been brought into their position on a wave of some sort of enthusiasm, at least. But again, it's beginning to come apart, the project, at that stage as well, and you have, as I said, splintering of the ITGWU in Galway. Also, the following year, Jim Larkin would come back from the United States. The fragments of Kremen's union tried to link up with Larkin's WUI when he came back, but it doesn't seem to have been sufficient to form a branch at any rate. And Kremen went off to. I found him next living in Coventry, where he had a second-hand furniture shop.
Just on the point of the Labour councillors, we were putting up posters for this event last week, and I was putting one up in Newcastle, and I heard this voice behind me kind of heckling and giving out, and I turned around and there was a former Labour city councillor who felt the need to object to this event. That tells you a lot.
Did he object to the event or the positioning of the poster?
I don't think it was about the poster, it was about the content.
Is that right?
Maybe that's I think, was there a question inside the door here a minute ago? Do you want that question? No?
I was just wondering,
There's a man at the back as well, I see.
Yeah, I think we'll go with you and then the back, is that okay? Yeah.
sure, I was just wondering, you said that when they voted for the Workers' Council and they tried to go to the council office, they were stopped by troops. Which ones? Like, were those pro-treaty, anti-treaty, or?
They were pro-treaty, yes.
Okay.
Yes, at that time, yeah. So, but there wasn't. It doesn't seem there was a determined incursion this time. It was two that were reported as turning up, but who knows? Maybe there was an underreporting.
Yeah, because you mentioned when the statue was dragged away, pro and anti-treaty both watching kind of interestedly.
Yeah.
And then again, there's more as well as this happening. There is that the setup to the Civil War.
Yeah.
But interesting in the town that day, what were both sides thinking, or who was taking what sides?
Well, the Civil War was the city itself was in the hands of the Free State pretty much from the Civil War. It was otherwise in the county, not too far from the city, but the city by and large was held. Yeah. Yeah.
Just a question, just to see what Professor Cunningham would think of the suggestion that in fact Ireland never had a revolution. It had a rebellion and a source of trying to throw off the yoke of English oppression.
Yeah.
But the underclass was not represented by the labour movement as such and the trade union movement, because they looked after people who were in employment. And that a ground swell of organisation never happened. We say Kremen wasn't suitable, he came in, he was devious, and then originally the 1916 man that's his statue was up the top of the square, he was another misfit, even though he had socialist ideas and he had this crisis with the Catholic Church. So there was awful intermingling between the two, but the revolution never came, or the real Soviet never came, and the people who were in charge of the levers of power were still there post all of this.
Well, Stephen Kremen couldn't have put it better than your last sentence. That's certainly what was perceived. I suppose, did the revolution ever happen? Well, there's an argument, if you think about mobilisation of people, that the revolution was of a longer durée, if you like, going back to 1879 and the land movement, which did affect a change in ownership of the land of Ireland. With regard to the trade union movement during this period, as to whether it was representative or not, I think briefly it was, in the sense that you have at the end of the war, at the moment when rural labourers and everybody else are members of the ITGWU, that in terms of the actual membership, at any rate, there's close to full employment briefly, and they're all in the movement. With the post-war economic downturn, then you do have people laid off, and you have huge unemployment You have the employers coming back to come for wage reductions and so on. So by this point in 1922, probably the horse has bolted already. The tide is going out, as was determined, and even the ITGWU, as part of its restructuring to face the new situation, ceased organising in rural Ireland at all. In that sense, your point is correct. And of course, there's also a tremendous infighting, as happens, I suppose, almost inevitably when a movement is in decline. People are going to be looking for scapegoats, and they're going to also be trying to maximise what part of it that they can retain themselves. So in the period of the downturn, you have fighting for members between the British-based unions and the ITGWU, and those British-based unions that are still retain a presence. So what are you doing here? Go back to England, essentially, whereas there were people, including in Galway, who remained loyal to the organisers and to the unions of which they had belonged. And then, of course, Jim Larkin comes back in 1923 from prison in the United States, and he essentially blames his successors, William O'Brien, Thomas Foran, and others, for selling the movement out. So you have another splinter. So you end up with a kind of a fracturing of the movement from quite early on in the 1920s. With regard to the attitude of the pro and anti-treaty factions, you mentioned Mellows, who became sympathetic to the idea that it was necessary to have a social programme if the anti-treaty forces were to get anywhere. Obviously, he didn't last very long himself. He was shot I suppose, illegally, really, in the detention of the new state in December 1922. But in general, on the ground, there wasn't really much of a difference between the attitude of the pro and anti-treaty forces to social struggle. They considered it a diversion from the national cause, as it were. So you can find examples of both sides cracking down on social struggle, whether agrarian or labour. With regard to the government, to William Cosgrave, who, as I said, thumped William J. Larkin back at a meeting back in 1919. His government had a phrase, took the view that labour unrest, union activity essentially, was they described it as came to describe it as labour irregularism. In other words, it was indistinguishable from anti-treaty activity. So there were measures were taken in accordance with that view to suppress labour unrest. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Do we have any more questions in the room? If not, there's one or two online that come up with.
Yeah, there's a man there. Yeah.
Was it the Galway Soviet? You said the Galway Soviet were the ones who renamed the square to Father Privet Square?
Yep.
And was this naming officially recognised by the country, or was it just passed over?
Oh, it was passed over, yeah. Yeah. The pulling of the statue couldn't be passed over because it was a fait accompli, but nothing else stuck. But it was about, I suppose, making a point really about a symbolic point really, I suppose. We've still got quite a number of things in the city named after Father Griffin. hurling club, a road. What else? There's one or two other things, isn't there?
Yeah. So we've got James on Facebook. He was asking. I heard that the Dunkeld Browns was dragged into the procession down Lower Doncaster Street, right past here. And
Yes.
as it is now. Is that correct?
Yes, it went down
Down the street. Yeah.
on the street outside here. Yeah,
And
behind the band.
Was do we know what happened to the bronze? Did they retrieve the statue at all? Do we know what happened?
It seems it was done. Somebody came along and in the middle of the night and made off with it and melted it down. Yeah. So the workers' movement didn't benefit in any way from this, as far as we know.
I've got another question from Willie on Facebook. He's asked, has the story been written up?
It has, and it'll appear in a book during the summer. A book called The Spirit of Revolution, Ireland from Below 1917 to 1923, which I contribute the article. I'm a co-editor of the book with Terry Dunn, and the book will appear. It's due in August from Four Courts Press, so a slightly longer version, an even longer version, more detailed version than you got there. I suppose one of the things I didn't maybe emphasise enough. I mean, I mentioned the band, the marching bands, and so on. This is one of the constant during the week, and in the days preceding, you have bands performing, playing it all at the meeting. So there's a lot of excitement, popular excitement around. A lot of outdoor meetings around the various housing estates as well. So a considerable amount of excitement.
Okay, will we wrap up? Unless anyone has any final thoughts? Just to thank John very much, and and just I suppose to say as well that this is organised people before profit, and I think, I don't know, for me anyway, listening to the story from John, it's inescapable, the kind of echoes of the current day situation with the poor housing condition and the shortage of housing and the desperate need for public housing and the lack of action by local authorities. So I think the need for tenants and workers to organise and for people power movements for system change is as urgent as it is now as it ever was. So I would encourage people to join trade unions, tenants unions, and also a socialist organisation such as People Before Profit. So if anyone would like to join, or even just keep in touch and be notified of future events and stuff, just come up and I can take your phone number or email or whatever, we can chat. And also Kieran here in the maroon shirt has a box. If anyone has €1 or two to spare, just to cover the cost of the venue. There's no pressure on anybody, but if you do, Kieran will gladly accept any donations there on the way out. Thanks very much, everyone.
And thanks for the invitation to speak, and to everybody for all the interesting questions.